recording.
What do I have to hit go? I'm recording.
No, it just starts.
You sure? Because that's like a stop button. Oh, that is. Oh,
Yeah,
they
because
want
it's
to-
it's
oh,
only
okay.
give you the option to stop.
Okay, so how do I like start?
You're in.
I mean, I don't see anything though.
Well, because nobody's in the room with you.
Really?
Yeah.
Out of 200 people, out of 100 people?
Nobody signed in 10 minutes early.
Oh, there's 12 people. Manage participants.
Oh, yeah. So there's. Here, why don't you ask people to type in the chat? Hi, Professor. You're talking. When you ask if they can hear you, press 1 to type 1 into the chat or something.
Hey, if people can hear me talk, type 1 into the chat.
There you go.
Yeah,
Thank
there we go.
you.
Thank you. All right, so now how do I make the audio?
Like, how do they get to talk?
No, I thought I'd make this visual.
Oh, like to show them something.
No, to show me. How do I put the camera on?
Start video.
Oh.
And then there you are.
Oh, okay. I'm into Zoom.
Yeah. We should change the name. Do you want me to change it?
Nah, don't.
Let's just change it.
No, don't change it. I'll try it.
Okay.
Again, we don't wanna. So, all right, so the chat is gonna come up.
Yep.
And then
if you wanted to. This is your phone deck.
Yeah.
If you want to go off video, you can stop video. Choose a virtual background if you want.
Yeah.
Here's this how you can see. This is how you can see who's on.
Alpha.
And then if you wanted to unmute someone. Yes, it's on mute right now.
Coming off. All right.
Okay.
So I guess the boxes get smaller and smaller.
Yeah. If you wanted to look at them, if you wanted to look back at them, you could tell them to. You could have them turn on their cameras, but there's really no reason to do that.
Oh, okay. No one's turning on their camera. I can't see them. No,
Yeah, I think that's fine.
yeah. Hello there, Alpha. Hey, thank you.
Please.
Okay, that's it. Thank you. There's so much to talk about.
Do you want to tell them about Piper?
Yes, I will. That'll be the first thing I tell them.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe I should. They probably can barely hear me. How do I sound? Pretty good or distant or the usual irritating voice?
Good.
Pretty good.
Really
Pretty good?
great.
Oh, okay, cool. Okay, because
Yeah.
I just put a headset on. Okay. Okay, Janine is here. We can start. All right, so I guess we'll get started in about 5 minutes.
Thank you for waiting for me.
Well, we couldn't get started without you. You've been online since like 3 o'clock this afternoon.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's all I have to do.
Right.
나는 음소거.
This is exciting. Just dozens of names are popping up. Joseph is here. Good.
Hi. How are you doing, Professor?
Very good. Thank you. We had some excitement here in our house. But I'll defer that conversation for a couple of minutes. I'll wait till everybody gets on. All right, take care. Go make dinner. Go make... Hey, Anna, can you close the door? Oh. Hmm. I hear little children in the background. Very cool. Oh, wow. I just realized it counts that we have 75 people on. Oh, we just lost one, 74. So back to 75. Okay. 76, 77. I'll give it one more minute. L is here. I just see a letter L on a green background. It's like Laverne and Shirley. Laverne is here. Laverne. As soon as we hit 80, we'll start the show. No, this might be it. All right. Well, I guess I'll get started with 77 people. It's a light audience, but 70, up, one more, 78. Do I hear 79? No, okay. So let's get started. So I think the way we'll do this sort of in a low-tech way tonight, but I think next week I'm going to get more daring and put up like visuals and things like that. And the way I thought I'd do it is if you guys could all go mute, that would probably be best. This way, no background noise. And if you want to ask a question, maybe contact me via the, we're up to 80. Contact me via the chat feature, okay? And either, you know, I'll let you ask, you know, we'll let you butt in at that point, or just chat out your question and I'll answer it. And I think I'll do that. You know, I'll stop every now and then, you know, and sort of ask for questions. So, and we're up to 82. All right, I'll stop announcing the. I sound like Donald Trump-like in my appreciation of how large my audience is. So, and we don't want to do that. So, anyway, I hope everyone's doing well, and welcome to our first virtual class. So graded the exam, as you know, and you got the results back. I must say that that was one bitch of an exam to grade, you know, trying to, you know, look at comparing screens to screens and sort of doing it that way, but we got through it. I'm hoping everybody rechecked their paper, you know, and because, you know, I certainly made a mistake. In fact, we had somebody, we put down 20 wrong for somebody when in fact they had 2 wrong. So that was, you know, just 20, you know, you make mistakes. And then there was one other one that we corrected. So anyway, yeah, appreciate you double checking and get back to us, and we'll I say we because I now have my team working for me here at home, and so it's become a group effort, especially there. Without them, they never would have persuaded me to try Zoom. And basically this all came about because I wandered into Hallie's room, and I noticed all of a sudden she was on Zoom with her class. And I said, oh, maybe I should try this. And it seems pretty good. So so far so good. The special project, let's talk about that for a second. I sort of left my instructions on there, you know, for those of you who got an A on the exam, which was about 50% of the class. Don't do, you could do the special project if you want to, but you don't, I would sort of discourage you kind of from doing it. But you can do it. I'm probably not going to read it unless for some crazy reason I need to read it. Like, for example, it's you're falling out of the A or something like that. And so then maybe I'll look at it if you're like on the bubble between an A- and an A, or a B+ and an A-, you know, I'll take a look at it then. So I'll look at it on a need to look only basis. Okay. I'm hoping to have something up this weekend, so that giving you plenty of time to complete it. Okay. And so I'll have that up soon. For people who passed on the midterm, I'm not actually sure. There were only 5 people who didn't take the midterm, and I'm not even sure. They may have dropped the class. So I'm not even sure if there is anybody who's online tonight who actually intentionally intentionally opted out of the midterm. You know, and so, you know, for them, obviously, this is an important, you know, an important grade. So let me know, actually. Let me know via email. Not right now by chat. Let me know via email if you opted out, but we'll be doing this project. And then for, you know, people who want to improve grades, you know, and I sort of identified who those people were. You know, certainly, you know, dive right into this stuff. And again, like I'm going to try to have it this weekend. Also, we're taping right now, so if for some reason an important TV show is coming on, you can always catch this on video later on. My daughter Hallie told me that the taping doesn't always work with her classes, So I don't know. I'm a tad nervous about that. But Anna just assured me that the tape is, yeah. In fact, yeah, I see the little button says it's recording right now. So I'll assume that we're going good on that, and I'll figure out how to post that recording someplace accessible to everyone. All right. So what next? All right. So let me tell you about the excitement that was in my house about 15 minutes ago, and you all just missed it. Our dog came in with her most recent victim. She killed the squirrel, and she came into the house with the squirrel in her mouth. And so that, as you can imagine, that caused a little bit of a stir. So thank gosh you joined us. It didn't happen now, because I would imagine that would have made for an interesting video. So all right, so chapter 7. So the first topic in chapter 7 was the calculation of the tax base for state tax purposes. I'm not going to cover that tonight because I already typed up notes, distributed them. I also did a 20-minute video on that. So why repeat myself? I feel like I've already gone through it twice with you. But there is some important stuff. There's a couple of questions for the final, or maybe one question for the final that was buried in that video. And of course, the key terms to know from there are the fixed conformity and the rolling conformity. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and watch that video. All right. So that's how the state tax system links into the federal tax system, right? So you have those conformity type questions. All right, so now I'm going to move on to, so that was like the first 2 or 3 pages of chapter 7. Now let's sort of leap into the sort of the bigger, chunkier topics in chapter 7. So the first one is apportionality. All right, and that means apportionality is just some interesting made-up word that sort of means, is it capable of being apportioned? And in order, and as we already know, in order for something to be apportionable, you need to have the pie. And in order to have the pie, you have to have a unitary business, right? So the first several cases in chapter 7 deal with what is a unitary business, because again, that as Justice Brennan famously said, a unitary business is the linchpin for apportionality. In other words, you can't apportion unless you have a unitary business. If a taxpayer has 2 unitary businesses, well then he's got 2 pies, right? Instead of one, he's got 2 pizzas instead of 1 pizza, and each one has to be apportioned separately. Each pie has to be sliced up separately. Okay, so it's been so long ago because it was the week before the midterm, I gave my preliminary thoughts on the unitary business. And I said, I came about 20 years ago, I was speaking at a conference, and I decided, let me make a total jerk out of myself. Let me say something funny. And I said, you know, it reminds me of how when the Supreme Court had to deal with pornography, the court eventually came up with the ruling, you know, we can't define it, but we know it when we see it. Or it was Justice Stewart said, I know it when I see it. Well, that's my definition of a unitary business. Hard to define, but I know it when I see it. And hopefully by an hour into this, you'll be able to identify a unitary business as well. So now every time I go to a conference, some other schnook is up there speaking, and he decides, you know, it's like, I know it when I see it, you know, and it's like, I go to myself, oh yeah, real funny, yeah. So, but they're all stealing my joke, and so it's painful to hear everybody else steal my joke. But anyway, so really the first case in the case book on this subject is Fargo v. Hart, which is from 1904. So this whole concept of unitary business goes back a ways, except that in this decision, they don't actually use the word unitary business. I guess that's introduced later on. But basically what Oliver Wendell Holmes, the judge in this case, is he basically lays out the whole concept of the unitary business. And but before going on any further, let me just talk about Holmes. you're not interested in that part, so I won't talk about Holmes. But he has this reputation of being this great judge, but or probably one of the more famous judges in American history. Certainly popular in Nazi Germany for all of his interest in sterilizing huge parts of the population, and which he's sort of fallen out of favor these days as sort of being a wise man. But anyway, back in 1904, this is when he's a young guy. He's only about 65. He lives on to be a judge at about 100 on the Supreme Court. So he's got a long way to go. But this is one of his first years. They give him this case, and he nails it right on the head. And the case deals with property taxes. Okay, the corporate income tax hasn't really caught fire yet in 1904. So this is a property tax case, and but it gets into this whole issue of what is the pie? What is the pie that the state can slice up? And so let's go to the facts a little bit. So the taxpayer is the American Express Company, right? They're still around today. We all know them, right? They're a big credit card company. But back then, they weren't. They weren't credit cards. Credit card wasn't invented until the 1950s. And American Express, just like Federal Express, was in the package delivery business. Now, as you know, Federal Express today has lots of trucks, right, and planes and all of that. None of this stuff is really around in 1904. The American Express Company owns a lot of horses, and they own a lot of horse-drawn carts, and they own stables where they keep the horses. So that's the kind of property that American Express has, except that they've been a successful company. And so they have two very significant intangible assets. And that's what this case is all about, is each state, or in this particular case, Indiana, doesn't want to content itself with taxing just the value of the horses and the carts and the stables that are in Indiana. They want more. They want a bigger grasp. So they're essentially after the intangible assets of the company. They want to include that in the tax base that Indiana can tax. And they're focused on two big intangibles. One is, as you can imagine, for a very successful company, American Express has got something called goodwill, right? They're sort of a household name, even though TV hasn't been invented, radio hasn't been invented, but American Express is well known. And so people, when they want to deliver packages, they think of American Express, number one. Just today, we think of Federal Express. And so their name recognition has a lot of value. It's if we were going to value the company, we would say we wouldn't just value it on the value of its horses. We would throw in the going concern value of the business, right? The reputation of the business enters into the value of the property owned by the company. So that's one item of intangible that the company has. The other one that they have is they've been very successful, and they've built up a huge amount of cash in the company. And they've been investing the cash. They've been buying up lots of bonds. And to this day, American Express Company they're one of the biggest holders of municipal bonds ever. And so even back then in 1904, they have about several millions of dollars. They have 15 million. That's a lot of money back then. They have 15 million of bonds sitting at their corporate headquarters in New York. And Indiana, in asserting their taxation, is viewing the pie as every single asset that American Express owns. Okay, that's how they're defining the pie, and they're going to slice up that piece of the total pie. On the other hand, American Express feels, well, wait a minute, no, we think you should only tax the value of the property that's in Indiana. So you should limit yourself to the horses. But you know what? Here's what we'll do. You can tax us on all of our horses and all of our carts, no matter where they are. But then you got to slice, but that'll be the pie, and you'll slice up that pie. And so the case goes to court, right? As when you have disputes, that's what the courts are there for, to resolve disputes among the taxpayers. And here's where Holmes delivers a very nuanced type of opinion. And he says he sees two different types of intangibles here. He sees the goodwill part of the business as sort of part of the first pie, right? That goes along with the horses, the stables and the carts and all of that. That all belongs together. Indiana is entitled not just to a pie of the tangible property, but they're entitled to a pie that includes some of the intangible property, that being the goodwill value of the company. But then he says, the assets that are the bonds and the securities, he goes, that has really nothing to do with the business that's in Indiana. That's a separate pie. And that pie is only in New York. So New York can tax all of the securities if they want to, but other states, that part of the business is only in New York. And the rest of the business is in the other 46 states that they had back then. And that's the pie that they can go after. So they can only divide up the animal part of the business. Yeah. So now Indiana makes a very interesting argument. And they say, well, wait a second. No, we think those bonds are really part of, there's really only one pie here, and those bonds are in that one pie. Because let's think of it this way. The American Express Company borrows a lot of money, right? And they, like any business, they borrow a lot of money. And that, the amount of interest that they pay, or the amount of credit that they're able to generate, relies in large part on the amount of assets that the company has. So Indiana very cleverly argues that the bonds are really part of the pie. They're indistinguishable from the rest of the business because those bonds help out the rest of the business, it gains them access to more credit and at better terms, and therefore it should all be part of the same business. Holmes says, well, he goes, and here's where he doesn't use the word unitary business. Instead, he uses the word organic connection. And he says, there's sort of an organic connection between the horses and all that and the reputational value of the company, but in other words, the goodwill and the customer lists and all of that, but there's no organic connection between the investments, the long-term investments made by the company that are in New York, and it doesn't really matter where they are. They could be anywhere. The bonds. Indiana is saying there's no, or the Supreme Court, Holmes is saying there's no organic connection between the bonds and the horse business, and only the horse business has nexus in Indiana, or I should say, is doing business in Indiana, and therefore we have two pies, right? So they're essentially saying American Express is in two different businesses: the investment part and the delivery part. Okay, and the now after the discussion of the case, and in the note immediately following the discussion of the case, they talked, what if this was working capital? Under the facts of the case, these were bonds that American Express had bought years earlier and was just sitting there collecting interest. And every year, out of the current year earnings, they just went and bought more and more bonds. I said, and clearly they were of more than 1 year duration, so they weren't part of the working capital of the company. So the question is raised: what if all of this money sitting in New York was really working capital of the company? And it suggests, well, maybe the answer in the case would have been different at that point, because basically, hard to run a company unless you have working capital, right? You always need cash on hand, right, to pay the employees and all of that. Sometimes there's seasonal variations. At Ernst & Young, we borrow money all year round, and then we collect all our money at the end of the year, and there's joy, and we pay off all our loans, and we pay off our partners, and we do all of that. But meanwhile, we had to pay the employees during the year. Well, that's because we drew upon our our cash reserves, and we borrowed money to do that. So the concept of the working capital, it isn't resolved in this case, but we'll see it come up again about 70 years later in the Allied Signal case, which is the case after the next one. Okay, how about I pause for a second? Any questions? Was that a good explanation? Give me some feedback. Good explanation, bad?
Yes.
Via chat? Nobody wants to ask a question? I'm doing a great job?
Professor, I have a question.
Yes.
So you said that in the case, the judge was saying that American Express has two different businesses. But
Yes.
then one is the actual business, as in they're delivering goods. But then the other one, is it the real business? It's just, like in terms of bonds and securities, they're not in the active business of the investment. So how do you?
Yeah, you're drawing upon a really interesting point there. How about for the time being, bear with me, because I think your question's about to be answered in the next case. You're saying, should we draw a distinction between, what if there were 2 or 3 different businesses going on and it wasn't cash? The answer to your question is, if let's say they were in delivering stuff, and they also built airplanes on the side, you're right, they would have had 2 different unitary businesses in that instance, and 3 actually, because then the cash sitting in New York would have been a 3rd business. Okay, even though you don't think of an investment as a business, how about for these purposes, we'll consider it a business. Okay, with me?
Yep, thank you.
Okay, so now let's move on. Next case, and Exxon versus Wisconsin. And that is 1980. Thurgood Marshall is the judge in the case. And the Exxon Corporation, I know you're all familiar with it. They're a big oil company. And in fact, they're not just an oil company, they're what's called a vertically integrated oil company. In fact, the company has 4 different divisions, all of which do very different things. So Division 1 is exploration. So you know what they do? They go out and they look for oil, and they're either successful or they're not successful, right? If you hit a gusher, right, you make a lot of money. But the way exploration works is you lose money too. You know, you can drill in 5 places, nothing, you find nothing, and then the 6th one, all of a sudden you find a lot of oil. So that's sort of a very speculative type business. Okay. Then there's the production part of the company. So that's when they actually find some oil somewhere. They have to get it out of the ground. So they have that part of the company, builds the oil derricks, and they pump the oil out of the ground, and they employ the wildcatters, to get, or the roughnecks, whatever they're called, to get the oil out of the ground. And then there's the next division, which is the refining division, right? The oil that comes out of the ground has to be refined. So it has to be turned into gasoline or more usable. All the impurities have to be taken out of the oil. So that's the refining division. That's kind of a profitable sort of business, but it has its own risks, right? Pollution type risks associated with it. And then finally, there's the boring part of the business, marketing, which is the owning of gas stations. And people come in, buy their gas, and they leave. Now, if I told you you can own one of these 4 divisions, well, which one would you want to own? And it would depend upon, if we want to look at them as separate businesses, we would say, hey, if if you're a roll the dice kind of person, you might like to have the profits associated with exploration, and you'll assume the risk of not finding anything. The other three are a little bit more predictable, right? Production, you make money. Refining, you certainly make money. But marketing, the actual gas stations themselves. I myself would like to own the gas stations because it's nice and predictable. But although you don't make a lot of money, you actually don't make a lot of money on it. And, when you pull into a gas station and you spend $20, the gas station isn't keeping 19 of those dollars. They're keeping about one of those dollars. They're using 19 to buy the gas, and then they're keeping like $1 for themselves. I don't even think I'm actually suggesting they get like a 5% margin. I don't even think it's that big. I think the gas stations only typically make 8 or 9 cents per gallon pumped. But it's nice and predictable. And when they sat down and figured out their business, Exxon says, hey, we have 4 different pies, right? And only one of those pies is in Wisconsin. And guess which one of those pies is in Wisconsin? Well, there's no exploration, there's no oil there, there's no production there, there's no refining there. The only thing they have in Wisconsin are the gas stations. So what Exxon did when they filed their tax returns is they said, all right, all of the profit, they figured out their profit for each division. And they said, Wisconsin, you're only entitled to the marketing. Now, granted, we have gas stations in all 50 states, but so that's your pie, the gas stations that are in all 50 states, and Wisconsin, you go take whatever your percentage of that one pie is. All right. So in other words, they're telling Wisconsin, all right, you can have 3% of the gas station pie. Now, Wisconsin is coming back and they're saying, no, we don't want 5% of the gas station pie. We want 1% of the entire pie. We want the whole, we're looking at your business, not as 4 different businesses, but as one big business. And we want to, and of course, what was Exxon doing? Well, they were being smart. They were offering up to Wisconsin the smallest, the least profitable division of their company. They were offering them a relatively big share of the crummy pie, the pie that had fallen on the ground and people had stepped on. So, Wisconsin is saying, no, we want the pie we want to slice up is the big pie. It's 1, not 4. So this is the dilemma that's in front of the Supreme Court. They apply the principles of Fargo, of the American Express case, and they come up with, Wisconsin has got a point. This is not 4 different businesses. This is one business. And after all the time I spent persuading you that maybe this was really 4 different businesses, well, how did they get to that decision? Well, Marshall examines the business itself, and he sort of reasons it this way. All right, so what does exploration do with the gas or with the oil that they find? Well, they send all of it to the production division. And then what does the production division do with the oil that they finish? Well, they send it to the refining division. And then what does the refining division do? Well, they sell it to the gas station. It's a vertically integrated oil company because they do all of these things themselves, as opposed to, there are some companies that just do exploration. There are some companies that just do gas stations. There are some companies that just do refining, right? You can be in one of these businesses. You can be in all 4 of these businesses. But what Marshall realizes is that they're basically, each of these divisions is codependent upon the other division, right? Refining doesn't buy gas from anybody else. They buy it internally from their own sources. So he sees, to go back and use the terms used by Holmes, that he sees an organic connection among the companies. He sees economies of scale. He sees common management. he sees he sees interaction among each of the companies, right? He sees sort of a unity of production, right? Everybody's all working together to produce one big set of profits for Exxon. Now, how does, and I think this is fairly important, this is significant. In their defense, Wisconsin, Exxon presents separate accounting evidence, right? And this is sort of the way you sort of try to defend when you're thrust into this position. They present separate accounting information, they get out their economists and they figure out, hey, look, we can prove that we only made a small amount of money in Wisconsin, not a big amount of money. And basically, Marshall says, no, separate accounting cannot overcome the unitary business principle. He goes, that's more important. Because remember, back when we were talking about prong 2 of the Dormant Commerce Clause, remember, what is our prime rule in state taxes? It's to use apportionment, because we value the rough justice, but ease of apportionment is easy, but it creates like only a rough justice type of answer, whereas separate accounting is in theory will produce a very precise answer, but it's very complicated, offers all sorts of differing opinions, and therefore it's not the way we want to go in state taxation. So the Exxon raises this really for 2 reasons. They want to attack apportionability. They want to argue that this is not one big pie. But then secondly, they also want to argue the second subject of this chapter, which is fair apportionment. All right. So we're not going to talk about that now, but those are 2 different concepts. Apportionality and fair apportionment are 2 different things. And but for now, let's just talk about apportionality. All right. Now, there's one more interesting tidbit to this case before I throw it open to questions. And that tidbit is the question arises in the case as to whether Wisconsin can come up with its own definition of a unitary business. For the most part, unitary businesses are not generally spelled out in statute. The whole concept arose, it's common law. It arose basically from judge-made decisions. It arose from the Fargo case. And so it's for the most part, it's judge-made law. Although, I think more recently, some of the states have been writing statutes about a unitary business, although they're hampered by the proposition that I raise, that it's hard to define, right? You know it when you see it. It's kind of hard to write that in a statute. So, but the case comes up here: can the state judges come up with a different definition of a unitary business than the federal or the Supreme Court made up version of it? And the answer that Marshall comes up with is yes. So long as the state's opinion of it is less expansive than the federal definition and not more expansive than the federal definition. So let me try to give an example of this. Let's say a state came out and said, in our opinion, the only indicia of a unitary business is common ownership. So basically, we don't care what kind of a business you're in. You can make jet engines, have a pizza parlor, and have all sorts of unrelated things. But the fact that it's pure ownership, well, that would not be allowed, because that would be a more expansive definition of the unitary concept, right? And the fact that we're only looking to ownership. So what would be a less expansive view? Well, the best example I can raise there is Arizona, which says that in Arizona, as far as under their definition of a unitary business, there has to be operational independence. So in other words, it has to be like Exxon. It has to be one division is selling to the next division, which is selling to the next division. So there has to be this commonality of it has to be production related. It can't be another indicia of a unitary business. So the point to remember here, though, is that the state can have a different definition of a unitary business than the federal. It's just that it can't be more expansive. Okay. All right. I'll stop right now. Any questions? Speak up. I know that 94 of you are still out there or have walked away and are doing something else, but any questions? Going good? All right. So I'll continue. The third case in the chapter is an important one, Allied Signal. Now, this case arises back in the 1970s out of one of the great takeover battles in American history. And I can't go through this case without telling you this drama, which was played up in the newspapers every day as if they were reviewing The Bachelor. The whole country was watching one of the most loony corporate takeovers of all time. It had the two main ingredients of the newspapers, right? It had money, power, and sex. It even had sex involved in it because, as it turned out, I won't describe that part of it, but trust me, there was a whole tawdry part of this whole transaction as well. But there was a company in Michigan, Bendix, that was mostly in the auto parts business. Okay, a nice, profitable business, right? And they wanted to do something completely different. They wanted to get involved in defense contracting. And they get their eye on this company called Martin Marietta, which is a big defense contractor located down in Maryland. And all of a sudden, and as was the big thing back, actually, now that I think about it, this was more the early 1980s, not the 70s. So back in the early 80s, what habitually happened when one company wanted to acquire another was they didn't do a friendly deal, they did an unfriendly deal. And an unfriendly deal was all of a sudden Bendix announced, hey, we will buy, let's say the stock was trading at $70. We're going to buy up all the shares of Martin Marietta at $90 a share, right? So everybody that owns Martin Marietta is ecstatically happy, right? Someone's going to buy their shares for $20 more than they're worth. Okay. So the shareholders of Martin Marietta are happy, but the management of Martin Marietta is not happy because what's going to happen to them once they're acquired? They're all going to lose their comfy jobs. So what do in defense? They decide, no, they're going to do an unfriendly takeover of Bendix. So each side goes out to the banks and they borrow billions of dollars in cash. And as part of this is how the case arises. Bendix suddenly realizes they've got to raise a lot more money. So they sell off a company called Asarco. We'll talk about that in a second, which is what the case is all about. So a few weeks go by and Bendix now owns all of the shares of Martin Marietta, and Martin Marietta owns all of the shares of Bendix. What we don't know is which management team is going to prevail and take over the other. And at this point, each of the companies is bankrupt. They've borrowed so much money and they keep bidding up the shares that basically they both scream they can't carry on in the deal anymore. They need someone to rescue them, and that's where Allied Signal comes in. Allied Signal comes in and rescues these two kind of misguided companies, and they buy up the shares of both companies, and so they become subsidiaries of Allied Signal, and of course Allied Signal no longer existed. Today they're called Honeywell. So, as I mentioned, during this takeover battle, Bendix sold Asarco, and when they sold Asarco, they made a gigantic profit. They made like $1 billion on the sale of Asarco. Now, they had owned 20% of Asarco. And Asarco, and to go back, remember, Bendix is in the auto supply business, right? So they make parts for cars. And Asarco is in the mining business. They own gold mines and copper mines and all sorts of different mines all throughout the United States, and in fact, the world. And Bendix sells the Asarco shares. They make a lot of money. So now Allied Signal bought the company, bought everything here, right? They end up with everything. They're the big winner in this whole thing. And they're stuck with the tax bill, right? They now own Bendix, and the taxability, what the case is all about is the taxability of Asarco. Now, Bendix, as I mentioned before, is incorporated. Well, who cares where they're incorporated? I think they're incorporated in Delaware, but they're headquartered in Michigan. And Asarco, oh, and I'm sorry, let me go back to Bendix for a second. Bendix does a small amount of business in New Jersey. And Asarco is somewhere, is actually headquartered in New York, but for the most part, the company is out like in North Dakota and wherever, I don't know, wherever all this mining occurs. In Colorado, they're sort of out there a little bit. So Bendix sells this for $1 billion, but they don't report any of that profit on their New Jersey return. And that's where this case originates. New Jersey goes, hey, I don't understand. Allied Signal, when you filed your Bendix return, how come we didn't get a piece of this $1 billion profit? We feel slighted. New Jersey issues a deficiency. They audit them and they issue a deficiency notice against Allied Signal, and they say, where's our money? So Allied Signal puts up the argument that Bendix and Asarco were two different pies. They were not unitary with each other. And quite honestly, they have a pretty good argument. For one thing, Bendix doesn't own 100% of Asarco. They only own 20% of Asarco. And moreover, are they in the same business? Hardly. What do auto parts have to do with gold mining? Unless they're making the carburetors out of gold, really nothing. And it's determined in the court that the companies have only insignificant association with each other. They said Bendix bought a little bit of Asarco's mine of Asarco ores, but they paid fair market value for it. So there was nothing untold going on. So quite honestly, this seems like a fairly easy case, right? They're clearly not in the same unitary business, right? The indicia of unitary are not there. What are so up by now? There's been a number of cases, and the thing that the courts look for, basically, the key indicia of unitary is common ownership, common management, some sort of unity of operations, and then lastly, and the one that I think is the most important, is economies of scale. Now, do you have to have all of them in order to have a unitary business? No. You can have only one of them and have a unitary business. So it's sort of, again, while there are these four principles, they're only indicia. All right, so let me sort of repeat them again. The key things that the courts have looked for is common ownership, common management, common operations, or some sort of unity of operations, and then finally the economies of scale. And they look at it here. Well, Bendix owns 20%, but that means 80% is owned by somebody else. So indicia of ownership, commonality of ownership, not really. Same business, car parts, gold mines, not really. Common management, well, That's to be determined, because if the management of Bendix is very involved in the management of Asarco, then that would be an indicia of unitariness. That's part of the I know it when I see it. Well, again, the facts come out. These are key points. Expert testimony is brought in court, and it's determined that Bendix really didn't do. What did the executives of Bendix know about gold mining? They knew nothing about it, right? They relied upon the executives of Asarco to run the gold mines. And then finally, were there economies of scale? By economies of scale, I mean, the more you make of something, the cheaper it gets, right? If you're making 1 car a year, it's very expensive. If you make 10,000 cars a year, it's still pretty expensive. If you make 1 million cars a year, they start getting cheaper and cheaper, right? Because you have scale at that point. So that's what they mean by economies of scale, that there's some sort of synergy. That's another good word to use. There's synergy going on between the two companies. Rather, why did Bendix buy Asarco? They saw it as a good investment. Coming back to the point raised earlier, right? This is sort of a little bit like Fargo, right? Where this wasn't so much another pie or another business, but it was an investment. But again, for purposes of our deciding pies, we're going to look at this. We're going to look at investments as being a business. Okay, with me? So there is nothing in the conventional wisdom here under conventional unitary theory that would suggest that this is a unitary business. But wait, all of a sudden, the Supreme Court comes up with something new. They come up with seemingly an add-on, an add-on possibility. They go, if an asset serves an operational function of the company, then that's apportionable as well. So the question that's now raised is, did Asarco somehow, was it somehow, what's the word I'm looking for? Is it somehow, excuse me for a second, I'm getting senile here. I just used it a second ago. Did it fulfill an operational function for the company? Well, what's an operational function? Well, let's go back to the Fargo case. Remember, the issue that was raised in the note following the case was, well, what if this was working capital? And that's the distinction they're making. They're saying if Asarco was a short-term investment, then it was working capital, a very short-term investment. Then it would be working capital, and you can't run a company without working capital, right? You need the ready supply of cash in order to, a company can't operate without some sort of, some amount of quick assets, right? Cash or assets that are convertible to cash. So they posed that question. They're saying if an asset, so we have the same basic unitary test, but then we also have an operational function test as well, a second test. So now let's go. So they introduced that as a possibility. So now let's go back to the facts. How long did they own Asarco? Well, they had owned them for several years. So it wasn't working capital. And that's the outcome of the case, that Asarco is not unitary with Bendix. So therefore, we have 2 pies, not 1 pie. And New Jersey, where Bendix had its operations, right? Remember, its operations are in New Jersey, but its headquarters is in Michigan. So it's thought that this is, Asarco was nothing more than an investment, a different business than the auto parts business, and that therefore New Jersey was not entitled for a share in the profits when Bendix sold Asarco. All right, with me? So that was the new test that was brought in by this case. Now, as is his wont in all of these cases, Hellerstein always likes to point out that he knows better than the judges. And he goes, well, I don't understand what they did in this case, because why did they make it a working capital type of definition? Working capital, for all you accountants in the class, right? Working capital has a specific definition in accounting principles. It means assets that are held for less than 1 year, right? Assets of what? Less than 1 year duration. So basically he's saying, well, this makes no sense at all. A company could have cash sitting around for a couple of years and they're drawing upon it. And here's where he misses the point, basically. In my mind, the 1 year rule had a lot to recommend it because it's a bright line, right? Remember, what are we interested in apportionment? We're interested in rough justice. And it seems to me the 1 year rule is a rule that can be is a rule that's enforceable. And Hellerstein doesn't understand that. And he's saying that there should be different criteria associated with whether an asset, a pool of cash, is operational or non-operational, or is unitary versus non-unitary. So this is probably a good point for me to stop and again ask for some questions. Nothing? Okay. All right. So the next case that the book gives very minor attention to, but which I think is somewhat important, is Mead Westvaco, which sort of a little bit, you ever have, Mead Westvaco is one of my go-to cases. I love citing it all the time because in my mind, it fills an important need in this whole concept of what is unitary. It's more significant for a different reason. And so I'll get to why some people think it's of some minor importance, but I'll tell you why I like it. So here it was a little bit, well, here, let me go through the facts. So Mead is a paper company, right? They own forest lands, they cut down the trees, they make paper, right? A nice, interesting business. I'm sure it's probably, you might consider it kind of low tech, right? They cut down the trees, they make paper, probably a nice steady business. Mead, for some reason, not really explained, they buy a company that has nothing to do with paper at all. They buy a company that you maybe many of you are familiar with. They buy LexisNexis, right? LexisNexis is one of our favorite companies, right? Because it enables us to do tax research, right? They're a platform for legal research along with RIA and CCH, right? They're one of the competitors. They're actually, LexisNexis covers all areas of law, right? It's one of the first companies that does computerized research. So basically it has databases of every single case that was ever decided and all the statutes in the United States, all bazillions of pages of them. And if you're looking for something, you type in a couple of words and it finds you a whole bunch of cases on the subject, right? I'm sure, if you had some library training, you probably, I used to teach the intro class. I used to always have the class go to the library and get instruction from the librarian, and she would tell everybody. Hopefully you all had that, and you all know how to, you've probably had some working knowledge of how LexisNexis works. But even if you don't, I just described it for you. It's a computerized database. It's like Facebook, or it's like, you know what it's like? It's like Wikipedia, right? You type a couple of things into Wikipedia, you find out all about something, right? It has very little, it has probably nothing to do with a paper company. But maybe it shares management. Remember, what were the indicia of unitary? Well, ownership. Well, they had that. Mead owns 100% of LexisNexis. All right, so they have ownership. I'm going to skip management for a second. Do they have operational interrelationships? Well, no. One company cuts down trees and makes paper. The other company provides a service, right? So there's no relationship there. And then are there economies of scale? Well, none. One has nothing to do with the other. These are two completely separate, different businesses. Except maybe management slips into this a little bit. So as it turns out, Mead has their executives are old line paper men. You know, they've been in the paper business for 50 years. And they understand the paper business. They know how to grow trees. They know how to cut them down. They know how to repopulate the land with trees. They know how to make paper. They're paper men. Okay. Whereas LexisNexis is sort of like your high tech startup, right? It's got some whiz kids running the company. And they don't directly control the management. They're not involved in the day-to-day operations of LexisNexis, but they do get involved a little bit, right? If you own 100% of something, even if you don't understand it, let's say you are lucky enough to own 100% of Microsoft, and you're lucky enough to have Bill Gates running the company for you. Are you going to step aside and say, Bill, run the company for me? Well, probably you would. You'd probably give him a lot of latitude, but you'd probably want to check into him a little bit, right? You'd probably at least maybe once a year say to him, Bill, how much money you need this year? And what do you think you're going to do? And how much money you think you're going to make? You would probably want to approve his business plan. And that's what Mead does with LexisNexis. They basically tell LexisNexis management, hey, you guys are a bunch of whiz kids. We don't understand your business. Go ahead, just keep doing whatever it is the hell you're doing. Just keep doing it because you're making us a ton of money. But once a year, we want you to check in with us. Tell us what your plan for the year is going to be, and we'll approve the plan. So this is kind of interesting because there's some management going on, but not a whole lot. And it's funny, often with auditors, you never knew, because everybody had at least that layer of involvement with their subsidiaries, right? And auditors would frequently go, well, that's the unitizing factor, is the fact that that the parent company could remove the officers of the lower tier company, or they had to approve the budget, or they had to approve the business plan. That was the unitizing factor. This case makes clear that that is not enough, right? They say, and that's why I find the case very, very interesting, is from a factual standpoint, that they found that was not a unitizing factor. What Hellerstein, not that he thinks it's really important, because again, this is really just like a footnote in the book. It's just like, I think a page is devoted, or a half a page is devoted to this case. I guess what was sort of interesting about the case, and this is beyond the nuance, this is like a half a nuance or something. They basically said, they referred back to Allied Signal and said, oh, the test that people seem to misunderstand the test that we had in Allied Signal. They seem to think that we created like a two-part analysis. The first part was, were they unitary? And then the second part was, were they operational? No, that's a misunderstanding. We're saying operational is part of the unitary test. So basically, they come up with a new word for it. Whereas if the two businesses are unitary, they call it business unity. If the asset is important, like cash, short-term cash, they say that's asset unitary. Is this important? No. Basically, the concepts were exactly the same. They just sort of changed the names so that we no longer use the operational, non-operational. It's more like, do we have business unity? And then the second question is, do we have asset unity? So in other words, it's an asset unitary with the business. It's a distinction, in my opinion, of absolutely no importance. I just mentioned it to you in that it sort of changed the nomenclature that we deal with. So now we have the business unity and we have the asset unity. Okay, that's my discussion of Mead Westvaco. Okay, questions? I throw it open again. I could use a good question at this point. How about if people tell me via chat, is it you're in complete understanding of what I'm talking about, or you're so far gone that you have no idea what I'm talking about? I shouldn't say things like that because, hey, you know, you guys proved to me you're a pretty smart bunch on the exam. You seem to be following things quite well. So any questions? I hear someone's ready to speak.
Yeah. So you said that this this case doesn't say that if a parent company can remove the management or approve the budget, and you're saying that that's not enough.
Yeah, that's not enough. It's not enough. It has to be more in depth. So the parent, because you see this factual scenario a lot. And let me give the great example of a non-unitary company, General Electric, right? It's sort of like an umbrella, a holding company, and they own about 2,000 different businesses, and they're all very different, okay? And if you were to say that just the power to remove lower tier management was enough, you've kind of buried the unitary principle, don't you think? You've kind of done away with it. Just the power to remove officers is not enough, because then everything would be unitary, right? So you'd be reading separate management out of the law. So they're saying when they refer to commonality in management, they really mean like day-to-day management. So to go back to the Mead Westvaco, for example, if the officers of the forest company were deeply involved with the operations of the the computer service, then that would probably fulfill the unity of management principle. Or going back to Allied Signal, if the management of Bendix was busy making decisions about the coal mines and the gold mines, then they would be deeply involved in the management. So again, how do you make this determination of how much is too much or how much is too little? Well, it goes back to my point. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. It's a jury issue. It's a factual issue for the fact finder to make the decision. Okay, so that's basic. There are no bright line tests. If you look at unitary type cases, they're all over the map. I'll give you some examples. There were cases in California, for all the well-known cases, there's 1,000 smaller cases that no one's ever heard of. In California, they once found that there was a company that made cotton shirts and polyester shirts, and they found that the two companies were not unitary with each other. Come on, they just made shirts, you know? I would have said it was one big shirt company, and don't give me this nonsense that the cotton shirts and the polyester shirts are two different businesses. There was later on, maybe next week, we'll get to the Woolworth case, where it was determined by the US Supreme Court, probably in a decision they wished they had back, that Woolworths, which was that's all before your time, but Woolworths was sort of like Five Below today, sort of like a cheap store that you bought like crappy stuff. And they said Woolworths in the United States was not unitary with Woolworths in the United Kingdom. They were in two different businesses, which was kind of silly. I think they were stretching it way beyond the point. But that, you know, when the issue is sort of factual in nature, different juries are going to come up with different outcomes, right? Reasonable people. When does a jury get to decide a case? When reasonable people could disagree. That's when that's when the jury, that's what the jury is the finder of facts. Now in tax cases, we don't usually have juries. The judges are the fact finder, but reasonable fact finders can differ with each other. That's why this is not an exact, this whole unitary business thing is not an exact science. It's however you can craft things. Now, this week, I've been pretty busy actually, just sitting at home. In fact, I seem to be working longer days at home than I do in the office. But this week, we had a company called me that was in the shipping business, and they were trying to argue. So one division of the company was a European company, and they owned ships, and then one of their subsidiaries was an American company, and they owned ships, and they were trying. And I can't. It would take me about an hour to tell you the story, but if you added the two together and taxed them as a single entity, they were going to owe a fortune to some of the states in the U.S. And they said, "Is there a way? Gosh, we never thought in a million years that this would be the result." And I said, and they said to me, "Can we argue that these two companies are non-unitary, and therefore they don't have to file together? You know, we can create two pies and not one pie, because then we have a much better result." And I said, honestly, look, I got to be brutally honest with you. A judge is going to look at this and he's going to say, "I see one big shipping company." I said, "Do you guys have intercompany transactions?" "Oh yeah. We frequently, what do they call the cargo containers?" "Oh yeah. We lend cargo containers back and forth. We lend crews back and forth." I said, "So you're operationally independent?" "Yeah." I said, "Then you're not then you're unitary, and it's very difficult." He said, "Well, we'd like to try to make this argument." I said, "I will take your money. I will make any argument you want to pay me to make. I'm going to tell you, let me be brutally honest with you. We are probably not going to win this case. If you want to pay me a few $100,000 to try this case for you, I'll try this case for you. I will try my damnedest to this case, but I have to be honest with you. It's highly likely to be a loser. I don't think that this is the way you should go down." So, and optics pay such a big part of it. I had a news conglomerate a few years ago that owned newspapers and radio stations in the United States, and they owned newspapers and radio stations overseas. And guess what? They claimed that one wasn't unitary with the other. And I said, you're in the highly likely they're going to see you as being in one big TV business. That's how again, when you try a case like that, you try to look for the differences. Some of their activity in Europe was like a sports network, and then in the U.S. it was more like news. And I said, well, maybe we can argue that a company that reports news is different from a company that reports sports, and so we can argue two pies instead of one pie. Was my heart really in it? No. I'm thinking to myself, do I want to turn down their money? Should I be frank with them that I don't think we're going to win this case? It's difficult, and I think the premise that Hellerstein puts in the book, see, this one isn't original with me. He poses the question: let's say we have a company. This is the same exact. Let me give you the same exact fact pattern. I said it last time. Let's say we have a company with 3 divisions. The first division makes chemicals. The second division makes human pharmaceuticals. The third division makes veterinary pharmaceuticals. So, do we have 3 separate pies, 3 different businesses? Or, if you wanted me to, I could argue that we have 2 different businesses, right? I could say we got the pharma division and we got the chemical division, right? I could put it that way. I could say we have dog medicine is different from human medicine, so I could say we have 3 different businesses. Or I could argue we have one big chemical company. I had yet another case this here, being I can't really remember things from too long ago. I had another case this week, also on this unitary principle, where, and this one was very unfortunate, because I took their money and I probably shouldn't have a few years ago, but this company had filed on a 2-pi basis. How about I put it that way, in Illinois, and we had a hearing scheduled. Oh, a couple of weeks ago, I found out that after the year and after these were like really old years. This was like, I think about 2010, 2011. They filed on a 2-pi basis. And then I found out afterwards, a few years went by, they filed on a 1-pi basis in the same state. This was Illinois. And I said, well, you know, yeah, you're making me fight this with one hand tied behind my back because you changed your position, right? Well, you know, the facts changed, so therefore okay, how did the facts change? I don't know. So I said, you know what? Look, you already paid me $20,000, but at this point, I don't think this case is going to come out well. I think we should settle, and why don't we make a settlement offer? And in fact, this was what's today, Thursday? This was on Tuesday. This is 2 days ago. I said, well, Illinois has been hit hard with this virus. Maybe they're into collecting as much cash as possible. So the deficiency was 150. So I offered them 75, and they came back at me, and they said, okay, give us 125 to settle a 150 case. So consider, oh, and then their letter back, they said, we know for a fact that you filed on a 1-pi basis and they mentioned 3 other states. I said, gee, how did they know that? And then I realized, well, I guess they talked to each other. You know, the Illinois judge had reached out to other states, and they found out that in other states, the same company had filed on a 1-pi basis. I said, okay, guys, you never told me that. We should never have brought this case in the first place. In my mind, 125 out of 150, that's a good offer. Let's take the offer, because you're not going to do better than that. This is the virus speaking. And we would never gotten this offer otherwise if Illinois wasn't in like desperate for money at this point. So that was the outcome. So I don't know, actually, I haven't submitted my offer, but I presume they'll take it. So that was that. So this is, you know, this is one of the key determinants in state taxes, is this whole unitary business principle. Does it come up every day? Yes, it comes up every day. At least at my level, it comes up every single day. Okay. Any other? I'm sorry, I moved so far afield. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Anything else? This is good stuff. The one thing I don't advise is there are going to be instances where you want to say, in one state you're 3 pies, and then the next state you're 2 pies, or the next state you're 1 pie. The states talk to each other. Be careful when you do something like that. Try not to take inconsistent positions among the states, because in some states it might benefit you to file it as one big company. In other states, it might make sense to break it out into 3 different groups. And in the past, I was a lot more liberal. When I started teaching this class 10 years ago, actually more like 12 years ago, I would say, oh yeah, that's part of the fun, is taking completely different positions in different states. And I don't do that anymore, because the states are now talking to each other and sharing information. So I try to take one position and stick with it, even though it hurts me. What I try to do is I try to look at the entity as a whole and figure out which is the better way for me to argue this, as 2 businesses or 1 business, right? With me? I had another phone call today on the casino business, and someone was asking the same exact thing. They owned sports books in the United States, and they own sports books in Europe. And they said, are we required to consider them unitary? And I said, it depends. You're going to have to provide me with a lot of facts. So my only point here is that this is something that concerns me every day. This is not, you know, every 10 years that someone asks a question about this and you really have to ponder it. This is so basic that it enters into the calculus for all planning that you do. Okay. So with me, can I move on or any more questions? You should have questions because this
Hi,
is,
Professor.
oh yeah, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a quick question.
Mhm.
Yeah, so as you just said, there should be like 4 commonalities between the companies to be a unitary business. Is it like for all of them, or like is it just like you have to have one of them and it should be?
Oh, that is such a great question.
Thank you.
And that is a really good question because I think, and let me describe, you're raising the possibility. Let's say you have companies, or it could be a single company or it could be multiple companies. Let's just stick with a single company. Okay, so a single company has got 4 different businesses. It's got Division A, Division B, Division C, and Division D. And if I'm understanding your question correctly, what if A is unitary with B and B is unitary with both A and C? Let's just leave it there. Let's leave D out of it. Do we have one big group at that point? Am I getting to the gist of your question?
Yeah, it's kind of similar, but what I was asking was like there should be the commonality between the management, the ownership, and then there should be the economy of scale and stuff. So my question was like, let's say there's company A and B, and for them to be a unitary business, should they have all 4 of those characteristics, or like is it like there should be like only one? Let's say like they have a common ownership, but they don't have a common operation. So is it fine, or like they should have like all of 4 of them?
Oh no, you don't have to have all 4. This is indicia. One can do it for you, or none can do it for you, yeah. These are all independent factors. You don't have to have all of them. You could have just one of them. Okay.
Right.
You can't
Thank you,
just,
Professor.
but you can't have just ownership. That's not enough. It's when you have ownership. Of the 4, I think the most important are the intercompany transactions and the economies of scale. I think that's what makes separate divisions unitary with each other. Okay, I think those are
Thank
the
you.
most. I think those are the most important. What I thought you were getting at, and this has always been a fascinating question, is let's say A and B are unitary with each other, and then let's say B and C are unitary with each other. Does that mean that A, B, and C, all 3 of them, enter into the same combined group? And there's no good answer to that question. It's almost like it's very much akin to conspiracy theory, where do you have like link chain? There's like link chain conspiracy theory, and then there's hub and spokes type conspiracy. And what I'll sort of describe that here. Let me describe, now that I introduce it, let me describe it to you. So let's say that let's make it fun. I'm plotting to kill somebody, all right? And I bring Mr. A into my conspiracy, okay? And I tell Mr. A, hey, I want to kill Jones, right? You with me? Yeah, I'm gonna with you. You'll drive the car, right? Okay, right. Then I go to C, and I go, hey, C, I'm gonna kill Jones. Can you get me a gun? And he said, yeah, I'll get you a gun. And then I go to D and I say, hey, D, can you hide me out? Yeah. Okay. So A, C, and D, B, C, and D don't know each other, right? I'm A, right? So I'm at the hub, and B, C, and D are my spokes. Okay. So now let's say the gun guy is caught. Do we all go to jail? Well, if it's hub and spokes, yes, we all go to jail, right? If it's link chain, we don't all go to jail because they can't, or there's not like a relationship among A doesn't even know the existence. B doesn't know the existence of C and D, so he can't be held responsible for their actions. So it's like unitary theory can go along those lines as well. I'm just confusing the issue, aren't I? There's no good answer to the question. Can you have like a link chain of unity? A few years ago, New York tried to pass regulations dealing with this link chain, and it was kind of crazy. They actually withdrew the regulations, but they went on for like 20 pages of, well, you test if A is unitary with B. Then, okay, now A is unitary with B. Now you test whether A is unitary with C or B is unitary with C. If they are, bring them into the group. Now, but if A isn't unitary with C and B isn't, is C unitary with A and B together? I mean, if you had a sizable company of 20 companies, they were asking you to test 10,000 relationships. They were very strange rules, and thank God after a couple of years they got withdrawn, but nobody really understood them.
Professor?
Yeah.
The base of the unitary change the answer. Let's say A and B are in unitary because of the common ownership,
Mm-hmm.
and C are unitary because of the
Common ownership is not enough, so change your facts a little bit. Okay.
or they have the unity of operation, and
Okay.
the other one is management.
Okay, that's good.
Unitary for each separate cases.
Yeah. So your question is, do all three of them enter into the same unitary group?
Yeah, because
Yeah,
they're in a certain
and it's a largely an unexplored question. That's where I think you have some freedom to argue it however you want to argue it. It comes down to this link chain versus hub and spokes type approach to it. It's hard to, it's just for fun, if I can find it, I should bring you in the old New York regulations from a few years ago, where they told you to how to test among 100 company group whether or not you had one big unitary group or you didn't. You will laugh when you see how crazy the state went with this. But they went with the approach that you just described, where they said, okay, check if A and B are unitary. Okay. Then they said, check to see if, now you got C. Is C unitary with A? No. Is C unitary with B? No. Okay, now you test, is C unitary with A and B as a group? Oh, yes, they are. Okay, so now they're added into the group. Now look at D, and you got to go through all that testing. Is D unitary with A or B or C? Are they unitary with A and B? Are they unitary with B and C? You see how complicated it gets? There's no good answers at that point. I'll be honest with you. Usually facts aren't that crazy. All right, I'm sorry. I know I'm just confusing everybody. Maybe I should stop talking. Any more questions? All right, so I've got one more case that I want to sort of discuss with you on unitary theory. All right, and it's actually the easiest case, but I always have, year in, year out, this is the one that confuses everybody because it's just kind of hard to explain. So it's actually easy to explain, but I don't know, people have trouble grasping the numbers behind it. So I will provide this weekend sort of an amazingly easy example of how it works. Then I think you'll completely grasp it. And that has to do with the allocation of expenses to both unitary and non-unitary divisions or companies in your group. So let's say you have a single company and they're in two different businesses. And this was a California case. This is the Hunt Wesson case, which doesn't get, it's like a footnote in the book. It doesn't get a whole lot of attention, but it's really worth talking about. So in Hunt Wesson, it dealt with the sort of the simpler situation where you had a business and then you had an investment. Okay. And under California law, the investment was if the company was headquartered in California, California got 100% of the investment income. There was no apportionment. It was just entirely allocated to the headquarters state. And if the company was headquartered outside of California, then California got none of this investment piece. So I'll call it, we had the business piece and we had the investment piece. All right, so you would think, okay, that sounds fair, right? We either get 100% of it or we get 0% of it. But then California comes with something really sneaky. They say, we have a rule that the interest expense has to be entirely allocated to the investment part of the company, and none of it gets allocated to the unitary part of the company. So it sounds like they're being fair, right? They're saying, okay, all interest expense gets allocated to the investment part, right? Until you cover it dollar for dollar, and then we'll start allocating it between. After that, we'll start allocating it between the two divisions. Well, think about it for a second. For companies that were headquartered in California, right? This was a great rule because you were allocating all of the interest expense against the part of the business that was 100% California, and none of it to the part of the business that was within and without California. So it was less than 100%. Conversely, if a company was outside of the state, you were allocating all of the interest expense to the part of the company that wasn't going to get apportioned at all to California. So in other words, you were losing all of your interest expense, whereas if you were in the state, you were gaining full use of your interest expense. So this case goes to the US Supreme Court, and they said, oh, this is an outrageous discrimination against interstate commerce. Knowing that you didn't follow my example very well, how about I post an actual numerical example of this weekend? I end up doing this every year, and we'll pick it up again next time. All right. So I'll show you. I think once you see the example, you'll laugh to yourself. How did California in a million years think they were going to get away with this? All right. So that's the Hunt Weston case. So I'll tell you what. No questions on Hunt Weston until I give you. I should have done it before class rather than after, but it's been a crazy couple weeks. All right. And now we've burned through the entire subject of the unitary business principle. And we move on to the next part of chapter 7, which is fair apportionment. Okay, so these are two different issues. The first issue deals with, again, apportionality. We can't have an apportionment scheme unless we have a unitary business. And if we have more than one unitary business, then we're going to have multiple apportionment pools. We're going to have different pies, as I like to keep saying it, the pie. All right. With fair apportionment, it's working out differently. Now we have a single pie. We're concerned with how the state asked us to divide up that pie. Was that fair? Okay, did that lead to a fair result? So the first case in the book on this subject is Underwood typewriter. This is 1920, so it's an early classic case on this subject. Justice is Brandeis, one of the great judges in US history. And the facts of the case are fairly simple. The company Underwood has its factory in one state, Connecticut, right? So they only operate in Connecticut. They only have a factory in Connecticut. But then they have a network of salesmen, and they sell the typewriters in the other 49 states. Okay, so they're making money all throughout the United States. They're selling typewriters in 50 states. They got salesmen out there selling the typewriters. But they make the typewriters in only one state. So if you were to look at this, if you were to break this down on a state-by-state basis, you would say, we're making money in 49 states, but we lost money in Connecticut, right? If we built a wall around every single state, we would say we lost money in Connecticut because we only sold a relatively small number of typewriters, but we made all of the typewriters in Connecticut. That's what this case is all about. And the apportionment factor is property over property. Well, the company's got almost all of their property in Connecticut. So the apportionment ends up being 47%. And the company brings in their economists, and they figure out that the company only made 3% of its profits in Connecticut. It made a relatively small amount, but the apportionment is leading us to a 47% result. And the company is telling the US Supreme Court, come on, is this fair? So I throw this out to the class. Is this fair? Should Underwood be paying 47% of its profits to Connecticut? What do you think? Is this fair? Well, I'm not going to call on anybody. So anybody who wants to anybody, all right, nobody wants to venture. So the Supreme Court ends, well, isn't this your classic unitary proposition, right? This is a unitary business. The sales division is only selling typewriters made by Underwood, so that it's seamless, right? We have operational interdependence between the two parts of the company. So accordingly, this is your classic unitary business. So correctly, we have one pie. The question is, did we divide up the pie correctly? And Brandeis ends up concluding, well, what is fair? What does fair really mean? And he goes, maybe, he goes, well, first he says property, it seems to be a fair way of looking at it, right? It seems to be fair on its face. And if every state used property, there's no danger of double taxation, right? This company would pay 100% of its tax among the 50 states. So that's not really the issue. Then he goes, well, but is it fair? Is it fair to this particular company? And he ends up concluding, yeah, it's fair. Is it perfect? No. Is it constitutionally fair? Yes. So basically, he doesn't find a problem. Basically, the case brings up 2 points. The first one, is the formula itself fair? The second question is, did this do fairness to the taxpayer? So the first question is basically asking, is there something inherently wrong with the formula? And the second question is all right, so the formula is fair, but did it do justice to this one taxpayer? Since there has never been a single case decided on the first point where they said there was something wrong with the formula, I'm going to have to make one up for you. So here, let me make something up. And I think I'm right on this point. If the formula was look at your sales, look at your property, and then look at your payroll and pick the highest of the three, I think that would be a formula that inherently would be bad because it would certainly lead to double taxation, right? This is something even like left over from the first half of the class. I think we all understand that, right? We're internally inconsistent. Therefore, we have the formula. There's something messed up with the formula itself. Okay, so I have to resort to a hypothetical there. The second question is did the formula do justice to the taxpayer? And it actually is fairly rare that formulas are sort of are sort of thrown out by the courts as being constitutionally infirm. Now, what you do see a lot of, and in fact, this is a big part of my business, is under state law, this isn't the Constitution, under the state laws themselves, there's often a provision saying, hey, if the regular percentage is too low or too high, both the government and the taxpayer can complain about it and bring a case for alternative apportionment. This is how I resolve, I would probably say 90% of my cases is we agree that there's something wrong with the formula with respect to this taxpayer, and therefore we'll compromise and we'll come up with something completely different, just some sort of a compromise between what the state is alleging and what the taxpayer is alleging. And I had a great, I had a great phone call on this today with yet another taxpayer and the government, and we got nowhere fast, but because each side was interpreting the facts so differently that it was basically day versus night, so there was no possibility of even broaching a compromise. But most cases get resolved under state law rather than under a constitutional principle. You know, right now we're discussing constitutional principles. Later in chapter 7, we'll get into the state law, how you can how you broach the state if you want to say that there's something wrong. And so constitutionally, not too often that they say that the formula itself is infirm, but in actuality, for non-constitutional reasons, we'll see that coming up with some sort of a compromise or some sort of independent basis is the real deal. Okay, so all right, so this case does not get kicked. Okay, they what is it? Underwood ends up paying 47% of its tax in Connecticut. All right, next case. I don't know if you can hear this background noise, but the rest of the family is in the next room talking up a storm. And all right, there's nothing I can do about it. So, all right, so hopefully you don't hear it. My little one, Hallie, she thinks everything is of monumental importance, and therefore you can't talk about it. You have to scream about it. All right. So anyway, I'm sure we all have relatives like that. So the second case is only like a footnote in the book, but it's really an interesting one, which is Bass-Ratcliffe. So in Bass-Ratcliffe, it deals with one of my favorite companies, Bass Beer. And back in the 1920s, and it's funny because when this was Prohibition was going on, I guess at this time. So it's funny that they were selling any beer at all in the United States. But Bass was testing the U.S. marketplace, and I don't know, for those of you who have traveled much or drinking beer overseas, it's a little bit different from our beer, and in fact, Bass back in the 1920s is not a big success in the United States. In fact, it's sort of an acquired taste. Nobody really likes it that much, while Bass is an incredibly successful company in the UK. So if you look at the company as a whole, it's making a nice profit. But if you look at New York State, they're losing their shirt in New York State. People don't like British beer, which tends to be served at a warmer temperature than Americans like their beer. So anyway, so the company they're losing money in New York, but they're making money overseas. And so, of course, New York State says, hey, the pie is the entire company. And Bass-Ratcliffe is arguing, no. The pie is New York State, because look, what are you doing? You're turning a New York loss into a New York profit by saying that the pie is the entire company. By apportioning the entire company, we're coming up with an incorrect result. Well, as you could imagine, who do you think wins? Well, I guess it's rhetorical because you can't really respond, but New York State wins the case. And what this case is sort of remembered on is that, yes, a state can turn a state loss into a profit by looking at the entire company, not just looking locally at the local company, because that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So, and that's it. It's that's the entire principle of Bass-Radcliffe. So it's like, it's barely a footnote in the book, but I thought I'd mention it. The next big case is Butler Brothers, and that gets a lot of attention in the book. It's like, it goes on for like 20 pages, but I will summarize it for you like in a few minutes. So now at this point, the whole area of apportionment has gone through a whole sea change. This case is from 1942. And at this point, things have changed a lot and how the states approach apportionment. They're no longer looking at it on a property over property basis. They're now looking at it on a 3-factor formula, the so-called Massachusetts formula, which considers 3 things: sales, property, and payroll. So it's like you take your percentage of property in the state, your percentage of payroll in the state, and your percentage of sales in the state. We average them together, and that's how we're going to apportion the taxable income of the entire pie and figure out how much belongs to that particular state. So an interesting way of looking at it. An interesting way of looking at it, and it's decided by an interesting judge, William O. Douglas, who, here I will bore you for a minute with some interesting facts about William Douglas, Bill Douglas, as he was known. Douglas, he was kind of my own personal inspiration. I found him to be like a fascinating person who, I always kind of liked him for various reasons. Yeah, I'll tell you in a second why he's my kind of guy. Douglas actually came very close to becoming president of the United States, in that in 2 years after this decision came out, 1944, the United States is in World War II, and Roosevelt doesn't like his vice president, and he's looking for a different running mate, and he wants Douglas to drop off the Supreme Court and run with him for vice president. At the last minute, at the convention, it's decided, he's a little too left-wing, Douglas, we have to drop him, and they pick Truman instead. Of course, they win the election. What happens 4 months later? Roosevelt drops dead, Truman becomes president, and so the country never experienced a Bill Douglas presidency, which is kind of fascinating in my mind, because by the time the 1970s rolled around and I was sort of paying attention to these things, Douglas had undergone a tremendous transformation in his personal life. For example, he was 80 years old at the time, and he caught some attention when he married an 18-year-old girl that was a waitress that he met, and he married her. That got, at the time in the 70s, that was sort of frowned upon. That didn't get a lot of favorable attention. But probably more importantly, Douglas had gone, and I was looking for it today. I wanted to actually show it on camera. He wrote a book, Points of Rebellion, which seemed to advocate the violent overthrow of the United States government. This is one of the problems that you have when you give these guys life tenure, is that they can go and do whatever they want because they can't be removed from office. And out of curiosity, I bought the book a few years ago, and it's really hard to distinguish most of the book between Mao's little red book in terms of everyone should just rise up and kill the president and take over the government. So as you can see, he's my kind of a guy, right, Douglas, and he sort of, I always found him a personal inspiration. Anyway, too much about me, not enough about you. So, but in this case, Douglas writes an interesting opinion. So what are the facts of the case? Well, Butler Brothers is sort of a, I guess one of these, it's a retail store, but it sells like closeouts. I remember in New York, there used to be this, maybe it's still there for all I know, there used to be this company called the Push Cart, where if you went there, Ping me if you remember the push cart. You would go there and you would buy junk that other companies couldn't sell, and the push cart would sell it. And that's what Butler Brothers seemed to be. And what made the company very successful was they were headquartered in Chicago, and there was like the buying department was in Chicago, and they would like look all throughout the United States looking for stuff to buy, and they would find cheap garbage and they would buy it up, and then their retail stores all over the country would sell it. So when they did their own economic analysis, and they brought in their experts, they were able to prove, and they present evidence in court showing that the people in Chicago made all the money for the company, and the people and the salesmen in California, the stores that were in California, actually lost money. And this case involves how can California divide up the pie? Well, Douglas goes, well, I think you're missing the whole point about unitary taxation. And in fact, California is very with it. They're not doing a property over property type allocate. They're using a 3-factor formula that takes all sorts of things into consideration, and therefore seems very, very fair to me. So I don't care that your experts can show a loss. I don't care if you bring in the world's greatest experts on this and show me that the company definitely lost money in California. He goes, I don't care. This is not an issue for experts. And he puts in a famous quote, which I scribbled down here. We need not impeach the integrity of taxpayers' accounting system to say that it does not prove taxpayers' assertion that extraterritorial values are being taxed. In other words, he's saying, I don't care what evidence that you bring in. It's irrelevant to me. I don't care if you bring in the world's greatest experts on store valuation. It doesn't matter. California's got a formula, and I'm going to follow the formula. In other words, the state has got a very easy burden of proof. The taxpayer has a nearly impossible burden of proof. We're going to follow the factors. He's saying essentially the taxpayer has an impossible burden of proof to show that constitutionally there's something wrong with the 3-factor formula. So basically, he's all in at this point, Douglas. He's saying apportionment uber alles. Apportionment apportionment is your answer, and we're never, from a constitutional standpoint, going to go with anything other than apportionment. And again, here he said, I believe you. I believe you that you have a loss in California. I don't care. It's not relevant. I'm following the formula. I'm going with the formula. Where this case becomes difficult to reconcile with earlier cases, or one particular earlier case, and that's the Hans-Reese decision, which was decided 11 years earlier in 1931. Now, in Hans-Reese, now keep in mind, Hans-Reese has already been decided. Douglas, right, following precedent, he should be looking at Hans-Reese and be using and trying to use it as a guide in deciding Butler Brothers. So let's go over the facts of Hans-Reese. They're a leather goods manufacturer, and they have almost all of their machinery and plant in North Carolina. And North Carolina has a property-only factor. And the way things are is that, the tannery business is like this disgusting business where they rip the hides off of animals, and they process it somehow, and it's a nasty business, and involves all sorts of chemical treatments and disgusting smells, and it's not a great business. But they make all this nice leather for us out of it. And basically all the disgusting work is going on in North Carolina. And then after they're done making the leather, They bring it up to New York where they have the craftsmen and they're turning it into gloves or wallets and purses and all the nice things that we like out of leather. Now, under the apportionment, because North Carolina has property over property and they don't consider sales and payroll, they end up with an 80% apportionment factor in North Carolina. And the company is saying, well, wait a minute. All we've got is a bunch of dopes in North Carolina that just, all they do is kill animals and process the leather, and all the good craftsmanship is going on in New York, and that's where all the value is being added. And they bring their experts to court, and they're saying, and once the experts present testimony that only 17% of the profit should belong in North Carolina. And that's how they reason it all out. So the formula is saying 80%, the expert is saying 17%. The Supreme Court decides the experts are right, and that it's only that North Carolina is limited to 17%. So wait a minute. Then how did Butler Brothers get decided the way it was decided? Well, Hellerstein says in his book, Douglas deals with this conflict in a very unconvincing way. In fact, he completely missed, a lot of people said that Douglas frequently missed the point in his opinions, but he's still my guy. So Douglas makes the point where he's explaining Hans Rees. He goes, well, it was completely out of whack. Hans Rees, evidence was produced saying that the apportionment was completely out of whack, that it wasn't even reasonably close. It was just so greatly distorted that it should not be followed. And Butler Brothers did not present similar evidence. Well, the hell they didn't. As a matter of fact, they presented even worse. They presented that, hey, in Butler Brothers, they go, the experts are saying we had a loss in California, but you, Douglas, are saying apportionment uber alles, right? We don't care about the experts. But in Hans Rees, they did care about the experts. So he deals with this conflict in a very unconvincing way. He just says, well, he's like Trump. He just, I don't care about the facts. The facts are unimportant. A second point is made, and Hellerstein goes, and here he's off base. Perhaps a more convincing way of explaining the difference between Hans Rees and Butler Brothers is that Hans Rees dealt with a single factor situation where all they were considering was property and nothing else. And that's why things got so distorted the way they were. And that in Butler Brothers, the three-factor formula was inherently much fairer, much more fair to everybody. And that therefore, that was the reason that the case got decided the way it did, except that Douglas doesn't bother to explain the case in that particular fashion. So whenever we have situations like this, there is this dynamic tension between, we have two historical opinions, one of which said, all right, from a constitutional standpoint, you have to consider the testimony of the experts. And the other one is saying, from a constitutional standpoint, you don't have to consider the testimony of the experts. You have two cases standing in that completely contradict each other, and yet one does not expressly overrule the other. Okay, so the explanation in the book is really good, and I would say you should probably take a look at that, where in the after Butler Brothers, where they compare Hans Rees with Butler Brothers, I think that's a really interesting discussion. Do I invoke Hans Rees now and then? Yeah, when I got a bad case and I can't find any other way of explaining the disparity, I say, hey, from a constitutional standpoint, there's a point where the court throws up and says, no mas, no, we can't consider this. Although, of course, I'm not usually running my cases on a constitutional basis. I'm usually looking for a state law basis for the resolution of the case. And as I said, as we will see in a week or two, state law often provides the out, right? We don't have to always resort to the Constitution. We can resort to state law to get modified, to get the apportionment thrown out and get a different apportionment scheme put in. So right now we're still concentrating on the constitutional aspect of it. Okay, I have 5 minutes and I think I can go through 2 more cases, and then I've done everything, all the notes that I've written out for tonight. So the next case in the book is Norfolk and Western. Now you may remember we already did this one, right? Norfolk and Western was the railroad case, right? Where, remember, back east they were hauling coal, and in the center of the country they were hauling passengers, and you may recall, remember they had the track mileage apportionment formula, and before you know it, Missouri was taxing the value of railway cars that never entered Missouri. And the only reason the case is repeated is that, well, now we know enough about unitary theory to say the way the case should have been argued, but it wasn't, but the way the case should have been argued was that they were in 2 different unitary businesses. And he goes, absolutely. Hellerstein goes, that's the way the case should have been argued. That it was, you had, even though they were in they were in the train business, one part of the business was hauling freight, the other part of the business was hauling passengers. They were completely different. This is where I sometimes think Hellerstein doesn't know what he's talking about, because as I made clear earlier tonight, judges don't always look that deeply or that in such a nuanced way. A judge could very easily say, nah, I see one big train case here. I see one big train company. I don't see 2 smaller businesses, cargo freight and passenger freight, human freight. So it's interesting to read. It's just a brief discussion of why he thinks they should have introduced the unitary business concept in Norfolk and Weston. And then finally, and we'll look at this, was probably the most interesting case on apportionment was Mooresman from 1978. And now, you know how 5 minutes ago I said, well, I guess the theory of Hans Ries is that the way you reconcile Butler Brothers with Hans Ries is that a single factor is unstable, while a 3-factor formula is much more stable and much more ready to give you the right result. Well, Mooresman is the case that reverts back, that looks at a sales factor only company and finds it to be constitutional. What the case is about is a company is headquartered in Illinois, and they sell animal feed, and a big part of the animals of this country are in Iowa. And Iowa goes and develops a sales-only apportionment scheme. And so therefore, he pays a lot of tax in Illinois, where he's got all his property and payroll, right? Pays a big tax in Illinois, but then he pays a disproportionately high tax in Iowa because they're sales only. They find this to be, and I think that this was a very badly considered case, and we'll talk about this more in depth next week. They find this to be a perfectly valid exercise of discretion on the behalf of the state, that a sales-only formula is just as fair as a 3-factor formula, and they approve it. And now sales only has become more the norm across the country. Then there's relatively few 3-factor states, and most states are now sales only. Notwithstanding the fact, as we shall see next week, that this creates an enormous discrimination, that this, you would think, is an enormous prong 3 violation, because it provides an enormous advantage to local business and is highly discriminatory against interstate commerce. How about I leave it there? We'll go into more depth into Mooresman next week, but I don't want to just leave you hanging with questions. So how about I take some questions now? And if there are no questions, we'll call it a night. And I would absolutely love to get some feedback from you as to how effective you thought this class was. So, so please, I want to get at least 20 of you have got to respond, whether you liked it, you didn't like it, you thought, to be honest with you, we're kind of stuck with it, but if you can tell me some ways to improve it, I would love to hear that feedback from you. So how about I take some questions now, and then if there are no questions, we'll call it a night. So questions? I still have 90 of you are still on the call. No questions? Okay, so someone earlier tonight asked, they didn't have a mic, did I go into foreign branches? No, that's at least a week or two off and we'll get into foreign branches, okay? No other chat questions that I can see. Oh, here are some questions. Will I be posting the notes on Blackboard? Probably not, because if you saw my notes, you would throw up. But I do most of this course on memory. You know, I jot out very simple notes to myself, and I really don't go into great detail. Oh, somebody said something very nice. It was a great class. Thank you. Have a good night. Class was great, very effective. Thank you. All right, so I guess good night. Stay safe. Can I go over the 3 factors? Yeah, how about we'll do that next week, okay? We are going to go over when we turn to the right now we're going over the constitutional aspect. We're going to go over the factors in great detail in the second part of chapter 7. Okay, believe me, you'll be sick of it. You're going to know more about the factors than you ever wanted to learn. So we will go over from a state law standpoint. Thank you. Well, this is very, very nice. Okay, great. Wait a minute, is it better than going to class? Not better than going to class, no. Oh, okay. All right, well, thank you very much. Oh, it's better, okay, better in person. This is we got a disagreement. Nothing beats in person, okay. I will tell you, I like in person because you know me, I like to jump around, bounce around. It's a little weird for me to just sit in a chair and talk to you. I must admit, that's really weird for me. I'm putting myself asleep. But yes, it certainly in person allows for more interaction. But look, if I had my druthers, would be in person, but it's not worth the risk to us all. So, all right. So good night. I got to get Anna in here to make sure that the recording is preserved correctly. And good night, everybody. Hey, Anna, Hallie, we're all done in here. Wave to the class because they're still there.
Oh, hello. That's so awkward. Stop recording.
Okay.
You want to stop recording?